Travel back with me to 1998. Resident Evil had brought horror games to the mainstream, and a little company called Squaresoft was in a golden age. They were releasing games like Final Fantasy VII, Saga Frontier, Prosciutto Blade, and they decided to dip their toes into survival horror with Parasite Eve. The concept for Parasite Eve came from the mind of author Hideaki Sina and his novel of the same name. It also spawned an adaptation into a movie in 1997. The story is one of a scientist whose wife dies in a car accident, and her kidney is transplanted into a teenage girl. Unbeknownst to the girl, the mitochondria inside the scientist's wife's kidney is sentient and is using her body as a host to give birth to pure mitochondrial life. Taking the form of the scientist's wife, this mitochondria creature, known as Eve, rapes him and uses his sperm to give birth to what she calls the ultimate being. Her plan ultimately fails, however, because the scientist's sperm contains its own set of mitochondria that rebels against Eve, causing the ultimate being to die shortly after birth. As horrifying and disturbing as this concept is, it doesn't seem like the type of thing that would translate well into a video game. So what Square decided to do was use the themes of the book to develop their own continuation of the story in video game form. And that's how we ended up with 1998's Parasite Eve for the PlayStation 1. Directed by Takashi Takeda, Parasite Eve manages to blend themes from both horror and RPG games to create a completely unique gameplay experience. Though still in its infancy, Resident Evil had already set the standard for movement in survival horror games with their tank controls. But Square decided to give the player full 3D movement just to prove that you don't need to be hindered in order to be scared. On top of that, the combat system was more reminiscent of early RPGs than it was of traditional survival horror. Utilizing an active time system, customizable gear with different stats, and a magic system in the form of parasite energy. Without having to rely on crippling the player in order to make them feel helpless, Square still managed to scare people with the horrifying atmosphere and disturbing imagery. It was less about jump scares and more about making the player feel real fear with having to deal with the horrifying things that were before their eyes. The main character is Aya Brea, a strong, no-nonsense rookie New York cop that's thrust into this terror that somehow involves her past. She squares off against actress Melissa Pierce, who turns out to be the new host for Mitochondria Eve. Eve's ultimate plan is to free the mitochondria from their prison and once again give birth to the ultimate being. Using Melissa as an unwilling host and aided by the deranged and mysterious Dr. Clamp, Eve is able to get her hands on sperm without male mitochondria, thus circumventing the problems of her predecessor. Throughout the game, Aya learns more and more of her part in Eve's twisted game, and the more she learns, the more she knows she has to stop Eve from giving birth to the ultimate being. A story like that captivated me whenever I was a kid. There was still so much I didn't understand, but all I knew is I certainly didn't want to play this game alone in the dark. A large part of why this game ended up being so horrifying was the music composed by Yoko Shimomura. Each track was both beautiful and haunting, and they perfectly set the stage for the horrors that were to come. Shimomura's music was praised for being inorganic and emotionless, and I can't think of two things that would describe it better. The first time I heard Eve's disturbing, operatic refrains, I knew I was taking part in something magical. Aside from the music, what really made Parasite Eve shine was the gameplay. Movement and combat are never once a problem, and on top of that, the game uses fixed camera angles and pre-rendered backgrounds, so the camera is never an issue. Weapon and equipment modification is surprisingly deep given the genre. It's a system that allows you to take the stats and abilities from different weapons and create your own customized arsenal. This was something that I'd never really experienced before, especially growing up in North America. We just didn't get games like this. Though it seems primitive now, customization like this is now a staple in so many different game genres. Though the mood, atmosphere, combat system, and movement were all spectacular, what initially got me playing this game were the graphics. In the 90s, Squaresoft were the gold standard when it came to cutscenes. The opening cinematic stands out to this day as one of the best intros to a survival horror game ever. And the first time I saw an animal transform into a mitochondria creature, I had to stop playing. It was just too much. So, why does all this make Parasite Eve such an important part of survival horror history? Well, because unlike so many other survival horror games of that era, this game still holds up. You can play it today and be just as scared as you were back in 1998. It was one of the first games I remember that dealt with truly adult themes. And it goes without saying that I was far too young whenever I first played this game. But it stuck with me much more than the original Resident Evil did. And it goes down as not only one of my favorite games of all time, but also one of the best survival horror and one of the best games Square has ever released. There's no game before or since that's made me feel so uneasy and so disturbed as Parasite Eve. So I hope you all enjoyed this video, and stay tuned in the coming weeks for a look at even more important games in the survival horror genre. And as always, I'm TG. If you like what you saw, you know what to do. If not, keep it sleazy. Keep it spooky.